it too. So thanks for being here today for this talk with Meg Reed. I'll give Meg a chance to introduce herself. Thanks for pursuing professional development by coming here today. And Meg, please introduce yourself and love to hear what you have to share with us today.
Sure. Meg Reed. I'm the Senior Coastal Policy Specialist with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is also the home of the Oregon Coastal Management Program. And I was going to talk a little bit today about kind of where I came from, like my career background, my passion, and things like that. And hopefully it might help you in your career choices and pathways and the options that might be available. And then talk a little bit about the Oregon Coastal Management Program itself and like some of our policy tools and the work that we're doing. But we can kind of bounce around, and I'm happy to take questions and talk through anything and skip anything that might be kind of important. So I'll just start, and actually just to go back to this, I don't know if you've been here before, but this is Sisters Rock, which is just north of the city of Gold Beach on the southern Oregon coast, and it's a really beautiful spot. It's super, super windy, but it's really, really beautiful, so I highly recommend going there. So here's some photos of me in my different roles and kind of pieces of how I got to where I am today. And so you can see me being really, really tiny here on the left with my younger brother at the beach. I grew up in New Jersey on the coast, so in a small town that was directly on the coast, and a huge tourist town, definitely would balloon population-wise in the summertime, lots of traffic, lots of tourists, all that kind of stuff. But that's where I grew up, and that's kind of what I was used to. And I really loved the ocean. It was such an integral part of who I was and what I was doing. And so I just knew really from an early age that I loved the ocean and I wanted to be doing things related to the ocean at all times. And so when I came time to education and college, I decided to major in marine biology. And I think it was the choice that choice, I think, was really because I thought that being a scientist meant protecting the environment. Like, I thought those things were synonymous. And it took me a while to figure out that that was not true. And that is not really necessarily a one-to-one thing. But that was what I had in my mind, and nobody told me otherwise. So I first went to this college called Southampton College, which was on Long Island in New York. But after 1 year, it went bankrupt and closed, which was very sad because I really loved it. It was really small, and I had really good experiences there, really great people. But then I transferred to Roger Williams University, which is in Rhode Island. It's still a very small liberal arts college, but it was on the coast on the Narragansett Bay, and just a smaller portion of it called the Mount Hope Bay. And I continued my marine biology degree there. And I was very much like in a place where everyone was doing research. Like, that was their thing, like they were very much coming up with questions and designing experiments and doing that stuff. And I hated it. I fully hated it. But my advisor was super great, and he was a scientist. I worked in his lab grinding freeze-dried fish into little powders to test them for mercury and all that stuff, and I didn't like any of that. And he was like, I don't really know what to tell you, but I want to help you find what you are looking for. And so that was really great. We talked about different things. We talked about like law school and environmental nonprofits and like all these different things that could be options for me if I didn't want to do research and I didn't want to go into academia. And so that was really helpful. And I did some internships. Like, I worked with the Audubon Society in Rhode Island for a little while, and I did like marine education there, which was really fun. I did like animal husbandry kind of stuff where you like take care of aquariums and feed the fish and like that kind of stuff, which was all nice. But I was like, this is not really for me either. So when I graduated, I worked for an advocacy group called the Public Interest Research Groups, which, like, I think a lot of people know, the PIRGs. They're in pretty much every state, and they're kind of consumer safety protection groups. And they actually were founded by Ralph Nader, and they often will take recent graduate students, like young people who are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed out of college, who don't have experience and don't necessarily need or want a lot of money. And so they're willing to work long hours and be really excited and things like that. So that's what I did. I ended up being in Seattle, Washington, working at the campus of the University of Washington with students and kind of like recruiting them and building them up as student leaders on different kinds of issues of the day, including environmental ones. There also were things about like textbook affordability and like credit card protections and stuff, but it also focused on greenhouse gas emissions and other things. And I learned a lot from that, especially how to talk in front of people. Like I would just have to go to a class of like 150 students, like a 101 level class, you know, and just like give a spiel and be like, hey, join me and we'll do this thing. And so that was intimidating, but it was really good practice and just like how to be an advocate. But again, I kind of didn't really feel like it was what I wanted to be doing. It also was really hard. Like it's great. That stuff is great for like young people, but it was really hard. I worked like 80-hour weeks and I was like, this is not sustainable. I went back to New Jersey and I worked for another nonprofit called Clean Ocean Action, which is, I'm in this picture down on the bottom screen. We did this event called Hands Across the Sand, which was an event that actually was international and trying to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels as a country and across the world. And so that was, again, a really cool experience where I was working with different people, volunteers, young people, and helping them learn how to be advocates for different issues. But all of these were focused on ocean kinds of issues. So like we had a liquefied natural gas export terminal proposed for off the coast of New Jersey. And so we were against that, working for to get people kind of against that and you know, doing campaigns and things like that. So that was really cool. Again, like really great experience, learned a lot of skills from that. But I felt at that point that a lot of it was pushing really far to one side of an issue. And I didn't feel like that was making progress in the way that I thought it could be made. Meaning like I thought we could make more progress by doing smaller things and working with the government and the people who actually have the ability to make change. Like we could make that change if we did it more in a compromised way. So that's kind of where I was starting to think of myself in this world of like, what is it that I want to do? How do I want to do it? And how can I get there? So it's still kind of figuring that all out. But then really fortuitously, we had a really big snowstorm in New Jersey and I couldn't get to work for a week. I was literally like trapped in my house. I couldn't even leave the house really because it was so snowy and so icy and nobody knew how to deal with it in coastal New Jersey, just like it is here when it snows. So I was fully trapped and I was bored. And so I started looking at graduate school programs and I started applying. And then I got into this master's program at the University of New Hampshire. And it was a really cool program. It had only been, I think it was only a year or two old at that point. It was called TIDES, which stood for Teaching in the Integration of Decision Making and Ecosystem Science.
Wow.
A mouthful. Yes. But really what that meant was kind of this interdisciplinary program that was looking at coastal resources and how do you manage them across these specters of science, policy, and management. And that's really when I started to find like, oh, this is what I want to do. Like you can take the science, which I really learned and appreciated, and use it to help with decision making. But you're also taking the people and what they want to do and what they don't want to do and what their opinions are and things like that. And then you're trying to work within the regulatory framework and try to find a way to make decisions that are good for people and the ecosystem. So that's where I really started to figure that all out. And I had a great advisor and I had very practical courses. It was a non-thesis program, so that was really helpful too. I didn't do my own research project, but I took a lot of classes and I did an internship at the Poyet Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve on Cape Cod, which is that picture up in the top. I sort of became a videographer. They were doing a multidisciplinary project there to evaluate blue carbon in wetlands, which was very new at the time. Like people had just started talking about blue carbon, which is a much more common term now, but it was brand new at that time. And so I was taking videos of the researchers, of the modelers, and all of those people and putting them into these little snapshots that people could more easily digest and learn about why do we care about this project and what does it all mean. So that was really cool because I learned how to be a videographer and edit movies, which is very difficult and I nothing learned before. So that was really fun too, to kind of learn these new skills and work in a professional environment with researchers and people who are learning about like the economics of it, like how do you make blue carbon credits available on like a cap and trade kind of system, like those are the things they're talking about. So that was really cool too. So I graduated in 2013 from University of New Hampshire with my master's degree, and it was actually, despite being a interdisciplinary program, it was a master's of science. And so then I was looking for jobs, and I applied for a NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship. These are programs that unfortunately that specific fellowship does not exist anymore. It's on hiatus because of federal funding issues, but hopefully it will come back because it is a really, really awesome program. They still have the other one that I also applied for, which is the Canals Fellowship Program. And both of these are really great for people who are interested in coastal management because it puts you directly with agencies and politicians who are doing that work. So for the Canals Fellowship, that's a 1-year program that puts you with a federal agency or with a federal legislator, like a senator or a representative's office. And then you get to have that experience. It's 1 year and it's in Washington, D.C. The Coastal Management Fellowship is a 2-year fellowship program, and that places you with a coastal management program throughout the country and even the U.S. territories. So, for example, in my year, I think you could have gone to the Mariana Islands. There's also Guam and Puerto Rico and things like that. And then, of course, everywhere, including the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes. So my year, there were 6 projects and they're all over the country. And I went to the interview. It was a week-long interview process. It was very crazy. And there were double the amount of fellow candidates that there were projects. So you go down 12 people interviewing and only 6 get placed with a fellowship program. So it's a little bit awkward and intense, but you meet all the different mentors from the different agencies. It was in Charleston, South Carolina. So we got a really fun week in Charleston, South Carolina. And I was luckily placed with Oregon, and they had a project that was really focused on spatial data. So creating new spatial data in an area that didn't exist yet for beachfront protective structures. So that's the bottom picture in the corner is me taking photos of riprap revetments, which are basically angular rock placed at an angle of repose to help mitigate erosion and flooding for private homeowners. And on the Oregon coast, we have some really strict regulations around who can and cannot apply for those. And so I was creating this new inventory of eligibility, we called it. And I had like almost 0 GIS experience. I took 1 class in grad school. But I think that's another good example of like, you kind of have to figure out what is the most important thing to you at any one time. And to me, at that point in time, I really wanted to be on the West Coast. I had met my now husband in grad school, and we both wanted to be on the West Coast. And we had to figure out like, how are we both going to get jobs after grad school in natural resources. He's a wildlife biologist. So like it's very place specific, both of our kinds of interests. So like that was important for me. Other people didn't have that kind of restraint and they could go anywhere. But I wanted to be on the West Coast and I loved the people who I was going to be mentored by. When I was there for that week in South Carolina, I was like, these are my people. Like they were so sweet, so fun. Like the pictures they showed of Oregon, I was like, yep, that's for me. Cool. And so I just felt like, even though the project was very GIS based, and I was unsure about that, I was like, this is going to lead to something else. And so I want to take this leap and go to Newport, Oregon, where I'd never been before, and do this tier project. So I did, and it was probably the best decision I've ever made in my life because it worked out really well for me. And the photo is actually another picture I took with when I was in my fellowship at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We did a group coastal staff meeting on kayaks in the Alsea River in Oregon. So I just want to share that, like, yes, work is work, but you can have fun too. And what makes work fun, at least in my perspective, is the people that you work with. The people really make your situation better. And so that is kind of how I got to this place in Oregon. Just to kind of summarize those things, and you probably can't fully see this, but so I got this fellowship with the Department of Land Conservation Development. It was actually a joint fellowship project between DLCD and the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, because the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department oversees jurisdiction of the beach in Oregon. And so those riprap structures that I mentioned, they usually go out onto the public beach. And so you have to get a permit through the Parks and Recreation Department. And they also didn't have a database of where those structures existed already. And so I made these two database sets of like, where are you eligible to get riprap and where is there already riprap? And then I did an analysis of that of like, how much of the Oregon coast is already armored and how much could be armored based on our regulations. And then how could we maybe improve our policies based on those challenges that exist. So it was really cool because yes, I did GIS and I figured out that I didn't want to do GIS anymore, but I also did policy analysis and I loved that. And so I think that was really the time of my career path where I really crystallized like, okay, policy is really what I like doing and what I feel like I'm good at and what I want to keep doing. So that was really a important learning experience. But unfortunately, when I was close to finishing my fellowship, the agency was kind of experiencing some budget cuts and there weren't going to be any openings for jobs. So I was like, okay, I just need a job. I don't care, it doesn't need to be perfect, but I want a job and I want to stay in Oregon. So I got a job with the Oregon State Marine Board, which is a recreational boating organization in Oregon, and I ran their environmental programs. And that was like a very unexpected but amazing experience. I had a really good boss. Who really gave me a lot of independence and also fostered lots of skills. And I worked with like river patrol people in the sheriff's offices because one of the biggest things I did was run the abandoned and derelict vessel removal program. And so there's lots of these abandoned derelict vessels all over Oregon, and I would help to find money to take them out and to get them out of the water. And that felt really good because it was like, I'm taking trash out of the water immediately, and there's an immediate benefit for that. So that was really cool. We also got some like really old boats out of the water that had been in the water for a really long time, including one that was like literally had sat over my desk when I was doing my fellowship project. My mentor had taken a photo of it. It was in Yaquina Bay, and at low tides, it was fully exposed, this boat, and it was like an old sailboat, and it was laying on its side. And he took a photo of it, and it was on right in front of me for 2 years. And then I got to remove it in this new position, which was, I thought, pretty cool. And so I was there for just over a year. And then my mentor at DLCD was retiring. And so I met with him and talked about his job and what he liked and didn't like and those kinds of things and whether I was a good fit. And so I applied, interviewed, and I got that job, which was pretty amazing. So I got back to DLCD and I worked in that position, which really focused on coastal hazards and beaches and dunes for 6 years. And then I was able to get a promotion within DLCD as the senior coastal policy specialist, which I started, I think 3 or 4 years ago now. And so I'm at a little bit of a higher level, but definitely doing more policy work, which again is what I really love. So I'm excited for that. But there definitely are pros and cons of moving out, right? You have more responsibility and you have to deal with a lot of controversy and challenging situations and things like that. But it's a natural kind of progression, I think, in a career path. So I'll talk more about that as I go through these slides, but that's kind of where I'm gonna switch and talk more about coastal management and land use in Oregon. But maybe if you have any questions before I move into that.
No, actually, I mean,
Sounds good. Okay, so I'll move into what is coastal management and what is land use, especially in Oregon, because it's done very uniquely here. So this is a good transition slide again, I think, because this photo, I actually took this photo from a small plane. And this is another perk of the job. One of the programs that we run at DLCD is the Oregon King Tides Project, where we ask people to go out during the king tides and take pictures of places that are being impacted by high water so that you can start to see how sea level rise will affect us in the future. And so sometimes we get partnerships with folks who fly planes, and you can take oblique imagery of the king tides from the air, which is pretty cool, and you see a different perspective. So this is Yukona Bay, the map of Yukona Bay in Newport, right after we took off from the small airport there, and I just was like, this is so cool. You get to like be in these airplanes, you know, taking pictures on a work day, and it was a beautiful day too. So it just was one of those things that works out, and it was pretty cool. So to talk about coastal management in Oregon, it all kind of started with the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972, which is a federal piece of legislation, so that applies all across the country and our US territories. And that really came about because the federal government was very interested in what was happening in the coastal shorelines of the nation. You know, and there's lots of reasons why, right? Like that is where most of the population tends to live, is in the coastlines. And it's not necessarily very true in Oregon. We have very rural coastlines here, but it is very true in other places, like in New Jersey where I grew up. Very true. And they also are places of a lot of economic importance and trade with other countries. They're also really important for national defense during conflicts and things like that. So the shorelines are important places from a national perspective. However, the federal government doesn't really have a say in how coastlines are managed. Generally speaking, that's done by the states or local governments. And so they created this program that's a voluntary program that says if you can meet these minimum requirements for coastal management as a state, you get two big incentives. One is money. So you get money from the federal government, and that's how I'm paid. It's how our whole coastal staff at DLCD is primarily federally funded. The second major incentive is this thing called Federal Consistency Authority, and that is the ability to apply state, and in our case, local policies to decisions that are happening in the coastal zone. When they are federal action. So whether that's a federal agency taking an action like repairing a jetty or dredging a channel, or an individual who is seeking a federal permit, like a Army Corps removal fill permit or something like that. We get that project and we review it, and we can say that the project is consistent, it's consistent with conditions, or it's not consistent and we object to that action. And especially when it's an individual permit, that stops the project from happening. And that's the only landscape where that happens. It doesn't happen in the rest of the country and outside of the coastal zone in coastal states. Like the federal government gets to do what it wants pretty much. Doesn't need to get state or local permits. So that's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big carrot. And so we became an Oregon Coastal Management Program federally approved in 1977. And we were the second one to be approved after the state of Washington. And all of the coastal states and territories are part of the Coastal Management Program, except for the state of Alaska. They decided that that's not for them, but everyone else is. And so as part of that, I'll move this really quickly so you can see this map is our federally approved coastal zone. And so it's roughly the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of our territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from the coastline. And everything in that is part of our coastal program, and that means everyone who has any authority in there is part of our coastal program. So that means all the cities and counties in that area and all of the state agencies that have any sort of permitting authority or policies in there. So like Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of State Lands, all of those have, they're all part of our coastal management program. So we think of ourselves as a networked program where DLCD is the home and we're like the administrative home, and that's where we get a lot of the funds for. But we work with all of these partners and they really help us to implement our program across the coastal landscape. We have a lot of policies and plans that kind of part of this, and our Federal Consistency Authority that I just mentioned. And I'm not going to get too detailed into that because that's like a whole other lecture for the intricacies of federal consistency. But it is a very important tool that we have. So here is a picture of our network. You can see all of the state agency partners. There's 11 total. Our counties, 8 of them, and then our city partners. And I think there's 32 coastal cities. And then DLCD also is home to the state's land use management program, land use planning program. And that was established in 1973 with the passage of Senate Bill 100. And it's a set of 19 planning goals that you see listed here that cover a lot of different topics. And it's very comprehensive in planning for development and for conservation. And that really became the foundation of Oregon's land use program, but also for the coastal management program. So it's actually why, in a lot of ways, we were able to meet our federal requirements for the Coastal Zone Management Act was because of this land use planning program. But DLCD is not really the implementer of that. We kind of hold these goals and what they require, but our cities and counties are the ones who are doing the work through their comprehensive plans and their development permits and things like that. Like how it's actually working on the landscape is mostly for cities and counties, a little bit through the state agencies as well. And the last 4 that you saw here that are in blue, those are the coastal specific land use goals. And again, those are really the foundation of our coastal management program in DLCD. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them and the tools that they provide for us. So the coastal goals are really spatial in their application. So that's why we have this little wonky graphic here where goal 16 is estuary resources. So that is literally the waters of the estuaries in Oregon, which is a very unique concept to have zoning in the water. It's really only done in Oregon that I'm aware of, and only in estuaries. So like it's not in rivers, it's not in other parts, but it is in estuaries. So that is pretty unique. And then we have goal 17, which is the lands adjacent to both all 3 different landscapes, estuaries, coastal lakes, and the ocean shore. And then goal 18 is beaches and dunes, so that's the sandy areas of the outer coast. And goal 19 is ocean resources, and that's our territorial sea, which is the coastline to 3 nautical miles out. And that one is unique in that it's the only statewide planning goal that's only implemented by the state. Local governments do not have a role in goal 19. And there's only,
Sorry. So like, is this like the whole goal, like these different goals, is just preserving it or like making sure people use it right, or like?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I will get into that. It's basically both, which is, it kind of like sums up our agency very well. Like we're the Department of Land, Conservation, and Development. So we kind of like balance those things of resource protection and economic development. So they have provisions for both of those things in each goal. And they work in different ways. It'd be nice if they were a little more uniform, honestly, but they were written by different groups and then kind of melded together. So I think that's probably why they have like different structures. I mean, they have the same overarching structure, but like goal 16, as an example, is I think the most prescriptive of all the statewide land use planning goals in like what it says you can and cannot do in the estuary. So it's very, very specific. Whereas like goal 8, which is on recreation resources for cities and counties, it basically just says like, plan for parks in your city or now. Like that's all it says basically. So they're very different, but these ones in particular are very spatial in their application. So our planning program generally, and these in specific, are inventory based. So they really work from like, again, coming back to that like science policy management idea, they're very much based on what is there, like what resources are present. Are there eelgrass meadows and tidal wetlands and like processing plants, seafood processing plants, marinas, like those kind of stuff, like what's there, and then how do we want to ensure those are either protected or further developed? So yeah, it's a good question. The one trivia, if you wanted to guess, there's only one county in Oregon that has to plan for every statewide planning goal except for goal 19, ocean resources. Can you guess which county might be? It's a tough question, but I'll go back to these. The real key is that like the county has to have both the Willamette River and ocean or coast. It's Lane County.
Oh,
Okay.
Because it has the valley but also goes out to the
That's
ocean. It's
Okay.
their coastline is very short. It's not very long at all, but they do have both of those ecosystems in their boundary, so they have a lot of goals to play for. Okay, so I'll kind of talk a little bit about each of the goals and kind of what are their main highlights. What do they bring to the table? So, like I said, goal 16 is unique in that it is zoning in the water in our estuaries in Oregon, and we have a lot of estuaries in Oregon. There's a map of them all on the right-hand side with their overall designation. So that's like the first thing the goal does is give a management classification to every single estuary in Oregon. We have 39, which is 22 major estuaries and 17 minor estuaries. And the major ones are all listed on this map with their designations. So their designations can be deep draft development, shallow draft development, conservation, or natural. Deep draft development, there are only 3 in Oregon, and that means that they have jetties at their mouths, and they have federal navigation channel of 22 feet or deeper. And those are Coos Bay, Equina Bay, which is pictured here, and the Columbia River. Then you have shallow draft development, there's quite a few of those, and they have jetty mouths, and they have a federal navigation channel of 22 feet or shallower. So like Checo and the Rogue and Siuslaw, Coquille River, all of those are shallow draft estuaries. Then you have conservation estuaries, which are generally, they don't have jetties. They might have some development, they might have some natural resources, and they're kind of like a mix. So a good example would be Alsea Bay, which is in Walport, because they have a port, like the Port of Alsea, but they don't have jetty, they don't have a navigation channel, but they have like, kind of like a mix of like some development, some alterations, and some significant natural resources present. Then natural estuaries are the most protective, and they are generally those that have very little human development or alteration on them. So a good example would be the Salmon River between Tillamook and Lincoln counties. It's like pretty undeveloped for the most part, has significant natural resources there and things like that. Then each of the minor estuaries, those classifications can only be natural or conservation, and it's up to the county to give that designation to them, which they've all done. And the next it's like a nesting approach. So they have this overall management classification, and then within each estuary, they're broken into these spatial segments that are called management units. So you can see that's why there's 3 different colors on Equina Bay estuary. Is the yellow is natural management units, the purple is development management units, and the bluish green is a conservation management unit. And they kind of follow the same pattern that I just mentioned for the overall designation. So natural management units are very protective. They have the most significant natural resources there. So like eelgrass beds, tidal wetlands, those kinds of things. The development is usually like you can see it's kind of snaking its way through. That's the navigation channel. And then like the marinas, the port facilities, those kinds of things are usually deep water areas that are developed and are appropriate for development. Then the in-between one is the conservation zone, which is the blue ones, which are, again, kind of this like middle ground of like maybe there are some alterations are allowed, but there's also resources present that need to be protected or restored. So that's kind of like the in-between one. This is kind of a breakdown of those management units by all of our estuaries in Oregon. So it shows that even though we do have a lot of estuaries that have a development designation, most of those areas are still in conservation or natural management units. So by doing this advanced spatial planning, which is all what like the land use program and coastal management in Oregon are all about, is this advanced spatial planning. We have already protected a really significant portion of our estuaries just by this first layer of zoning in our estuary management plans, which were all developed in around the 1980s, 1990s. So it was a significant step for protection of wetlands in particular, which were rapidly declining in that kind of era right before the land use program was put into place. So this really helped to stop that massive, decline of wetlands in Oregon. I mean, we still have a long way to go to restore a lot of places, but it really helped to stop that thing from happening. And also again, thinking about economic development and our communities and what natural resource extraction and things like that are still important to many economies. And having the appropriate places for those things to happen, but also recognizing that you need healthy ecosystems for those things, like Dungeness crab fisheries. Most crab larvae live in estuaries at some of their life stages, and so it's really important to protect those areas and make sure they're thriving. So it was kind of a nice setup. One of the biggest challenges though right now is that these plans and all comprehensive plans, strat working, not just specific to the coast, were meant to be updated periodically. That's how they were developed. But because our program has gotten chipped away at over time by the legislature and at local levels, and the lack of taxes and things like that, basically periodic review planning has gone away. And so these plans across the state, particularly on the coast, are like 50+ years old. And again, it's based on inventories, so that those inventories change over time. But if you're not updating your inventory in your plan, then you're still making decisions based on those inventories from the 1980s, 1990s. So that is a really big focus for my job in particular, and our program generally, is to update these estuary management plans. And it's really, really hard to do this because, as you can imagine, like going back to that last slide, and how much we protected when those plans were first developed. These plans generally took, like, especially in the big estuaries, took like a decade to complete, and a lot of money and political will to get them moved forward. And so doing an update kind of requires the same lift. You need money, you need political will, and you need that time to kind of get the community engaged in that and understanding it, because land use in general is very complicated, and a lot of people don't necessarily engage with it every day or understand it. So it's difficult to kind of do that community engagement, but it also is very important. So these are kind of just some topics of why we need to be updating these estuary management plans. And a big one that I'll point out is the tribal engagement in particular, because when these plans were developed, the tribes were generally all had been terminated by the Western Termination Act of 1952 in Oregon. And a lot of our federally recognized tribes were just kind of working to get that recognition status back from the federal government, and some of them didn't even get it back until like the early 2000s. And so these plans were developed without tribal engagement. And they're really important to these plans because they do have a lot of cultural significance in estuarine areas. They have areas where there might be cultural resources and artifacts, and first foods and just kind of cultural practices tend to be around estuaries. So we definitely are making an effort to engage with tribes when we're doing these estuary management plan updates so that their voice is more incorporated. And just as to share what these images are showing, the one on the right is from the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan, and it's the old map. So like these maps were like hand drawn back in the 1980s, and it's not bad, but it's hard when you're trying to like zoom in. It doesn't really like give you that granularity because it's not in a GIS. Like it's like just a paper map. But this one is from the only estuary management plan that we've successfully updated so far, which is in Uquita Bay. And just for the city of Newport, the county hasn't done the update yet, but this is now GIS. And so this is kind of like a plain map, and we have lots of versions of this, and you can see each of the management units has their number and their designation, and it goes back to the plan, which describes those management units and what's allowed and not allowed and things like that, and it works within the city's existing GIS system where they have their city limits and their urban growth boundary and things like that already integrated. So it's so much easier to work with that and to implement the policies when you have good maps and good data. So we're trying, but it is very difficult to get personal money for these efforts and then getting the like momentum and the political will. So I'm going to turn now to our next goal, and this one is on coastal shoreline. So again, those lands that are immediately adjacent to estuaries, coastal lakes, and the ocean. And I think of this goal as our working waterfronts goal. And so it's really recognizing the uniqueness of the lands that are next to tidal waters, and that there are both important resources there, like riparian vegetation, but they're also really important for economic development. So you need, like for some kinds of businesses, they need access to the shoreline in order to be viable, right? Like so a port, a marina, a seafood processing plant, fish ice, things like that. So there is pieces of this goal that are specific to that protection. Like they have to protect a minimum acre of water dependent zones. And so that is part of it. And I think this image is from the city of North Bend in the Coos Bay estuary. So you can see that there's like a lot of working waterfront stuff happening here. They had like a sawdust mill and log storage and things like that going on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like you said, there's three major rivers on the Oregon coast.
Mhm.
For the Columbia River, how far does the estuary go back into the Columbia River? Like, is it pretty far? Like, so?
It's a great question. It goes to the western edge of Puget Island, which I think this is Puget Island actually. Is it? No. It might actually be further down. But it's river mile 21, I think. I just like had it in my brain. I learned so much with the Army Corps recently on stuff in the Columbia River, but yeah, it coincides with the boundary of our coastal zone.
Gotcha.
So we have that written with our federal partners and in statute of like what that edge is, like very specifically. And so yeah, like the tide, as you probably know, goes very far all the way through Portland.
Yeah.
But the estuary for regulatory purposes is it's basically the edge of the Clatsop County border.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if we had the whole thing, it would make it even more of a nightmare to implement than it already is. It's already very complicated because it's so big and it is, obviously by state.
Yeah, because you were talking like earlier, like, oh, which counties like have both of these things? I was like, I think Portland does, but I guess Portland isn't part of it.
They don't.
Well,
Yeah, it's fully within Clatsop County. And then this is actually also within the cities of Astoria and Warrenton. So they have to have pieces of it that are all coordinated.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And just a kind of a fun, I think, anecdote of how Goal 17 has been successful in its implementation in a very clear way is if you're familiar with Newport and they have the Hatfield campus where like OSU has buildings, but also the NOAA research facility and boats are there. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they were based in Seattle, Washington for a really long time, those big research vessels. And then they went to bid and they said like other cities across the West Coast, like who wants us as our home port, and Newport and Lincoln County went for it. They put a proposal together and said like, hey, we want you here. And one of the biggest reasons they could do that is because the site where those vessels are right now was zoned water dependent. And previously, in years previous, there was a proposal for a hotel that wanted to be put there, but the city denied it because it wasn't water dependent. And because it didn't get built, they could do the NOAA research facilities there. And that the fact that research facility is there has been a huge economic boom to the economy there. Like they got new jobs, they got tourism dollars, all sorts of things happened because of that decision. So I just think that's like a really cool example of how these things work in real life. Like sometimes people may feel frustrated or mad, like I want to build a hotel and that's gonna be great and like all this stuff, but you can build a hotel anywhere. You can only have shoreline access in some places. So it is really important to think about those as a non-renewable resource and they're important to protect. There's lots of other pieces of it, but one of the main ones that I'll highlight here, besides the water dependent zoning, is there's also protections for coastal public access in Goal 17. And basically what it says is that cities and counties are to plan for public access with the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and provide that access and then also increase that access over time. And so we're actually right now doing a rulemaking effort to further clarify what that requirement means for local governments and how they will implement it. Because what we've found over the last 50 years since this requirement has been in place is that local governments have really just verbatim copied the language in the goal, but they haven't really put a lot of strategic thought into how they're doing that. And so, especially in this time right now where coastal public access is very highly sought after. We saw that for sure during the pandemic, that one of the only things people could do was go outside, right? And they went to the coast. And So we had a lot of people coming for coastal access, and then we want to have more access for people with mobility challenges or other things, like these Moby mats that the Lincoln City has put out, and infrastructure and facilities and things like that. So we're putting more effort into it. I'm doing that rulemaking right now, and we're having a public hearing with our commission on Thursday for the draft rules. So that's pretty exciting, and hopefully will be helpful to local governments and the public generally. Okay, so I'll kind of go through the rest of these fairly quickly because I probably spent way too much time on the other ones. But the other goal that we have that I'll talk about is goal 18, which is the sandy parts of the ocean shore. And this is what I actually used to work on in my previous role. So right now I'm the subject matter expert for goal 16 and 17, and we have my colleague Rhiannon is the subject matter expert for goal 18. But I did work on it previously, and this one can be very controversial because oceanfront development, people get very wrapped around that kind of concept on lots of different ways. And so one of the pieces of this goal is it has a prohibition for residential, commercial, and industrial structures on the most active dune landforms. So basically the idea that it's an active place, right? The beaches are active, they're always moving and changing, and there are some places that are just not appropriate for permanent development. You could maybe do a boardwalk or smaller things, but you can't do houses. And I really love this photo, which is in Pacific City, that again kind of highlights how this policy has worked in practice. And so these houses that are in the sand dune, those houses were built before Goal 18 was put into place. So they were built in the 1960s. So if Goal 18 had been there, they wouldn't have been allowed to build it because they're basically on the crest of the foredune in that area. And they have constant problems, right? There's sand inundation, sand erosion, all sorts of things are happening in that space all the time. And these homeowners are constantly having to deal with it. Versus this development, which was developed after Goal 18 was put into place. And so they weren't allowed to build a dune, and they all set back from it. They have a nice stabilized vegetated dune. They don't have to deal with erosion and sand accretion problems, and they still have access to the ocean. So that's what Goal 18 does for us. And honestly, a lot of our problems in the areas that we have to deal with all the time are legacy development, places that were developed before the land use program was put into place. The other two main provisions are listed here. So there are strict regulations on dune grading, and that means lowering the dune to improve ocean views. It used to be prohibited, but the people were doing it anyway, and so we came up with these requirements that really help to preserve the integrity of the dune. Mostly it's width and stability in providing, erosion and flooding protection. And so you can do it, but under very strict circumstances. And then the third piece is the beachfront protective structure limitation. So those are riprap and seawalls and things like that to prevent erosion for private property. They have really massive impacts on the beach. They starve the sediment cycle, and they can cause scour, and they just kind of lower the beach profile over time. And so with sea level rise, we'll get to places where you might not have any public beach at all because you'll have an armored shoreline and the waves just come right up to it. And so you can't safely access the beach. And we are already seeing that in certain places, like in Nescoin, which is in southern Tillamook County, during high tides, you can't walk on some parts of the beach because it's fully armored there. So that's actually what I did my fellowship project on, was those the eligibility, like I said before, if you're eligible or not eligible for beachfront protective structures, and I made that inventory, and we still use that inventory now, which is pretty cool. And this is kind of just another example of what I talked about, those maps and why it's so important to have new maps and new inventories. This is the inventory we did in 1975 of our beach and dune areas, and they have labels of stabilized dune or foredune or active foredune and all those kinds of things based on their geomorphology. And those are pretty much what people still use to make decisions for Goal 18. And again, it's not in a GIS, and you can't zoom in, you can't lay tax lots over it and things like that, so it can be really difficult to use. But we just paid the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries to complete a full inventory of our Goal 18 beaches and dunes that are more up to date, and they're in a GIS, and they actually have even new landforms that we didn't even have before because of the dynamics of the coast, and especially because of the vegetation we have. on the coast, which is a whole other conversation we could talk about, but yeah, so you can see here, this is an example from Tillman County and Rockwood Beach, which is pretty exciting. Tillman County did adopt new maps, and we're trying to get all the other jurisdictions to do it too, because they can't use new data unless it's officially adopted into their plan. So it doesn't just like you have new data and now you can use it, and you can't. You have to have a public process to amend your plan and to make sure that everyone has a chance to know it and understand it, which is a good thing to do, to be transparent about the data you're going to use.
I have a question about a couple slides back about the houses being swamped by the sand.
Yeah.
Are those houses still being like bought and sold and like
Yes.
moved around? Okay, so there's no plan done. Okay, so it was.
Yeah, we really don't. I mean, like that concept of, most people call that manager tree.
Mhm.
And I just heard like the tribe in Washington who was doing that, they called it upland expansion, which I thought was really fun. Like that's actually better, right? Because people hate the term manager tree. But they're calling it upland expansion, where they're like moving some of their physical and essential facilities to upland areas, and they're mostly doing it for tsunami inundation risk. But I mean, we also have that, so we can have co-benefits for sure. But yeah, that idea is I think it's still in its nascent stages here in Oregon, and because nobody wants to talk about it, nobody wants to deal with it, it's very hard. But it is something we need to think about, because if you don't do managed retreat, you have unmanaged retreat, right? Which is gonna happen either way. So be better to be proactive about it. Okay, so the last goal that I'll talk about is goal 7, which is not a coastal goal, but it is the area subject to natural hazards, and we certainly have a lot of natural hazards on Oregon maps. We're all of them pretty much. I wanted to bring it up because we did a really cool project a few years ago that looked at tsunami resilience, particularly through the lens of land use planning. And we worked with 10 communities on the Oregon coast, both cities and counties, to update some of the regulations around for inland use that specifically address tsunami resilience. And we worked with the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries on this, so they created some data maps for us. And then we used that to adopt some new regulations. And these maps are really cool. This one on the left here is called Beat the Wave Maps. And it's an analysis that looks at any point in a jurisdiction and like how fast and how far you need to go to get to high ground before the first tsunami wave arrives. And it's color coded by your walking speed. And if you look closely at this one, which is in Nadana Beach, which is in the northern part of Rockaway Beach, these dark colors here, like that blue is a sprint. Nobody can maintain a sprint for that long of a distance to get to high ground. So we use this as a planning tool to really highlight areas that are most at risk and what is the barrier for evacuation, and is there something we could do about it? So it helps to prioritize facility improvements. So for example, in this case, the reason why this is so high is because there's a bridge here and it's not earthquake retrofitted. So it won't be usable in a tsunami situation where you have to evacuate. So that could be a place where maybe you retrofit the bridge and then that community can get to high ground so much faster, right? Like they just have to go up here versus down here and up here. So it really helps to highlight what are things that we can do as a community to improve our evacuation. The other thing that we had is these are just the inundation maps themselves in the middle. So, they're color coded based on the size of the earthquake event, which would be the resulting tsunami size. And different communities have very different risk. And so we would give them flexibility, like they're called t-shirt sizes, if you're familiar with small or extra large. And so we'd say which of these do you want to choose and tie your regulations to? And most of the regulations were focused on critical and essential facilities. So like mostly public facilities, like police and fire stations, schools, hospitals. And I would say you can't build any new of those in the tsunami inundation zone. You can still build, single family dwellings and things like that. But if it's like a more dense development, like a new subdivision or a hotel, you would be required to have evacuation improvements as part of your development plan. And then it gave some development waivers for going above and beyond tsunami resilience. So a good example of that would be if there was a new hotel built in the tsunami zone, it could get a waiver for height restrictions if it was also a vertical evacuation structure that could hold people in an earthquake event. Most jurisdictions across the coast and probably here too have a height limit of like 30 feet, 35 feet. So you'd obviously have to build it a lot higher than that for tsunami inundation purposes. Like if you're familiar with the Newport campus, where they built a vertical evacuation structure at an OSU facility, and it's huge, right? Like it's very, very tall and very, very well engineered. So those are the kinds of things we worked on. We did some work on tsunami caches and how you can do community caches, and like things like blue lines and leaving the tsunami zone, just like education kinds of things. And I really found that to be almost, of my whole career at Dale City, the most rewarding project I've worked on, because we did a lot of community events and presentations with community members or city councils and planning commissions. And it was just a topic that people were really happy to engage on. They wanted to know more about it. They wanted to do something. They did have some like pushback and concerns sometimes, but you could usually work through it and kind of understand where they're coming from. So it was just like a really great way to have these robust conversations and do something very tangible for proactive evacuation planning. We don't really do it anymore, partially because the funding kind of has like, funding kind of ebbs and flows, right? And like, what are the priorities? And right now, well, until recently, the priorities were very much on like climate change adaptation, like sea level rise and things like that, not necessarily on acute hazards. But right now, it's probably much more like economic development and like things like that. So when we apply for grants and get extra funding, we kind of have to like prioritize it to like, what is the grant looking for, So, which is unfortunate when you don't have just like general money to do good planning work, which we used to have, like I said, but we don't anymore. Okay, so those are our big main planning tools that we use to do policy updates. We also do some programmatic work. And I'll kind of skip through these quickly, but I just want to share that our agency does work statewide. And so we do have programs that talk about the gamut of climate change resilience. So we think about our programs in 3 buckets: adaptation, sequestration, and mitigation. Adaptation is, like there's already so much climate change baked into the system. How do we adapt to that? Sequestration is how you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, or like in lands that already hold it, let's not release it. And then mitigation is actually trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we do a lot of that through our transportation planning. We have the Oregon King Tides project that I mentioned already. This is a really great resource that I would recommend. We have a Flickr account, and all our photos are there. They're generally all Creative Commons licensed. So if you need photos for a presentation or a poster or things like that, they're really good pictures to share kind of like impacts of water on our coastal communities. We've developed some sea level rise planning resources for our local communities, and we've tried to put it into practice and through a NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship project with Carl, who's pictured up there. He led this project in Clatsop County for 2 years and did a bunch of community outreach and workshops, including with the schools. And that was really great to talk about sea level rise in these communities. What are they concerned about? What do they want to do about it? And then kind of give it back to them and say like, okay, now it's in your hands to like do some resilience projects. Similarly, we have this other project that we've been doing called Estuarine Resilience Action Planning, which are more focused on estuary communities. They've been very bottom up of like, who are the partners in the area? What are they concerned about in their estuaries? How do we do something about it? And the result has been these lists of resilience projects and actions, which have been really great because it helps with grant projects and proposals that are already kind of vetted projects that are ready to go. So that's been really helpful. And the last thing I'll share is this other grant program that we recently just went away, which is really sad, but has been a super benefit to Oregon Coast, which is this habitat protection and restoration funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. It was funding that just went to coastal management programs. And because we don't own or manage land, we open it up to our partners to apply for this money. And we've been very successful at getting projects funded. And most of them have been land acquisitions on the coast. And many of those have actually been land acquisitions that are going back to the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. And especially this one, which this is such a beautiful photo of Cape Foulweather. And it's like a headland on the Oregon coast. And it's gone back to the tribe now, and it's the first piece of oceanfront property that the tribe has had since we stole their land. So it's been a really nice partnership to bring back lands to the tribe, and they're protected lands now. And then we've also had some partnerships with a few other organizations and entities, both on land acquisitions and habitat restoration projects. So that's been a really cool project. I think I'll just skip to the end, which is, again, opportunities for you. Like I said, the NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship is sort of on a hiatus until hopefully one day we'll have more federal funding available for it. But there's the Canals Fellowship is still available, and Oregon Sea Grant also does fellowships, and they are really great opportunities to work with agencies or other partners on coastal topics. And kind of, it's a good way to kind of practice, right? Like, see if this is what you want to do or is that what you want to do, and that's valuable too, to know what you don't like as well as what you do like. And all of these folks in the photo are people who did do fellowships and are generally still working in Oregon state government or related fields. So I think it's a really cool stepping stone to do a fellowship and then keep it going for your career. Okay, that's it, and I'll take questions.
All right, thanks, Meg. That was great. So much information. Meg.
Yeah, that's like
Sorry.
That's a very dense talk you gave, which is awesome. Thank you so much. So I think career development is sort of where I try to make the context for students.
Yeah.
And you described kind of your background and how you came up professionally. What would you say with the reality of where today is versus when you were getting started is quite different, right? So what are some like areas that you see for hope and for growth and like new, like when you mentioned a lot of the data is not in GIS databases, like it seems like there's a big opportunity to kind of digitize some of that surveying and whatnot. Are there other kind of similar like ways students can apply their skills to career opportunities going forward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I will note that like when I graduated college, it was 2008, so that was like the Great Recession. So job opportunities were not great at that time either. So I think like looking for if you wanted to do government work, but you feel like that's not the opportunity right now because of hiring freezes and federal funding and all that stuff, there are other opportunities with like local governments, I would say. Like that is such a huge need for the Oregon coastal communities in particular, is good staff members who work for the city or for the county, whether that's land use planning or parks and recreation or engineering or whatever, like there's a high demand for like good professionals. And it is often a good stepping stone for just recent graduates. And you don't have to have a land use planning degree to work in those fields, because they are rural places. Not everyone wants to live in rural places. So I mean, like if that's not for you, then that's fair. But if you would be open to it, I think it's a great learning experience. You can have really great mentorship opportunities there, learn a lot of different situations, and then kind of go on to a career maybe in Portland or Bend or whatever, like if you're really after a bigger city or even like state government. So I would highly encourage people to still look at local government opportunities because I still think there's a lot of opportunity there, especially if you don't mind living in like smaller towns. The other thing I would say to look into is like consulting companies, both small and large. We work with a lot of consultants in DLCD, and there's still lots of opportunity for that work. And then like nonprofits, some of them do rely on federal funding, but a lot of them actually don't. They rely more on like philanthropic kind of donations or just like from their membership. And so they're still fine right now, despite like federal government limitations. So I think that like working for a nonprofit is still a really viable career option. And they're again, it's like a really great place to learn a lot of skills. You don't necessarily have to have like this huge resume to apply for and get those jobs. I think there is a lot of opportunity. I mean, GIS, like you said, is a good one too, and there is a lot of opportunity. I think it just varies on like where you do that. You could do that at a consulting firm, or you could do it for local government, or you could do it for us. There's lots of places. I think GIS skills are definitely in demand, generally speaking. Our department just actually fully expanded our GIS department. Like we have way more staff now doing JS than we ever had before.
Cool.
So that's cool. And I don't know that all the positions are even filled yet. So like we might still have a couple of openings. Yeah. And if you like the state government as well as federal government, like you have to kind of know how the system works, right? To like get into that because the whole state of Oregon uses like one platform for doing your application and all that stuff. So you have to like know that that's where you have to go. But you can like sign up for like alerts for like jobs that come open every week. You can get like a digest of who has openings. Like right now is a great time to apply for seasonal jobs with Oregon Parks and Recreation Department because they're looking for a lot of seasonal rangers all across the coast and the state really to work at their different state parks. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity.
Cool, thanks.
No pressure.
So like I wanted like my specific degree is I'm in environmental science. We're going into like water policy, like water management, resources like that. And that's what I was like. I really wanted to come and see how like land use and like how the policy side of that. I was just, is it just like what's the best way to get into like policy that sort of thing? Like working with those small companies and stuff like that. Like working with cities, internships, that sort of thing. Like.
Yeah, I think all of the above. Like, there really is no right way to do it, I think as long as you know that's what you're interested in, just look for like jobs that kind of have like a policy regulatory kind of nexus. But like, yeah, the water one is really important and something we're trying to spend a lot more time on with DLCD in our partnerships. Like, there's the Water Resources Department, as well as the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and they're really important with housing in particular because like you can't build new housing if you don't have facilities, right? Like if you don't have sewer and water and things like that. And we've done kind of a poor job in Oregon of like making the connection really clear. Like we can we might have some like places that allow for new development, but then they come to get like a building codes or something and they like can't get it because they like to build a new water main or whatever is like so expensive. And the developers are like, nope, never mind. And like, so that is a really important one. And especially with our drought conditions recently and water rights and things like that. So like, water is a huge topic right now. And like data centers too, like if you've been tracking that, that's a big deal too, because the amount of water that data centers use is insane. Like it's crazy. It's so much more than like a municipality uses, So like there's a lot of debate happening with data centers right now and the water usage in particular. And even just like energy, like solar farms and wind farms and like all that kind of stuff. There's always a water component. So I feel like water is a good place to go. Very interesting. And like dam removal and like salmon protection and like there's so much of that too. Like
I'm in a bunch of different like classes, like and one of them is environmental assessment right now, and it's like that's like learning about like the salmon restoration, like what are the pros and cons about we're trying to restore all this habitat, but like it's so much money sinking in like we use for other things. So I get that.
Yeah, it's wild, but I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity there. So keep it up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Meg. This has been super informative. Thanks for all your insights.
Yeah.
And thanks for coming today.